For the Environmental Health Australia and New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health, or EHANZ, webinar for World Food Safety Day. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the original custodians of the various lands on which we are meeting today and their continuing connections to land, sea and community. And we pay respects to them and their cultures and to elders both past and present. My name is Melissa Byrne and I'm the National President of Environmental Health Australia, and I would like to welcome you and to Tanya Morrison, the New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health National President, and who will be co-hosting this webinar with me today. Tanya, it's lovely to see you again at a more civil hour of the day on the 4th of June in the very early hours of the morning. Tanya and I participated in a forum with NEHA for the United States of America for their World Food Safety Day celebration with food safety regulators from the US and Dubai as well. And on Saturday, the 7th of June, it was World Food Safety Day. And food safety is a shared responsibility for everybody between governments, producers and consumers. Everybody has a role to play from farm to fork and to ensure the food that we consume is safe. This year's theme, food safety, is science in action. It's a timely reminder that food safety isn't just a checklist. It's a dynamic, evolving challenge with science as a foundation for ensuring we can all have access to safe and sustainable food. Food safety science is in our paddocks, factories, research centres, and even in our data systems. And behind all this complexity, the central question remains at the forefront of environmental health professionals. How do we keep our food safe from farm to fork without compromising innovation or access? And this is where science steps in. Today, we have two speakers who will be sharing their knowledge and experience in food safety and how they are implementing science in action. And if you have questions for a speaker, simply type it in the comment section and you're welcome to comment at any time, and questions will be answered at the end of the speaker's presentation. Our first speaker today is Judd Owen. Judd brings over 17 years experience in environmental health and food safety, working across local, state and federal government agencies. He is currently the Senior Food Safety Risk Manager at Food Standards Australia New Zealand, or EHANZ, where he oversees Chapter 3 of the Food Standards Code, ensuring our food safety standards remain effective and fit for purpose. And today, Judd will be sharing insights from a unique regulatory case study in his presentation titled Cats, Dogs and Planes, Assessing a Change to the Food Standards Code. Welcome, Judd.
Thank you, Melissa. I'll just share my screen. Okay, thank you very much. Hello, it's an absolute pleasure to be presenting to you today. I've been an EHO for a long time. I guess I haven't really been on the tools for a good 10 years now, but I did spend a significant time as an EHO through local, state, and then now the federal government at EHANZ. So I've always, I think it's very, very important that we talk to EHOs, people on the ground, as much as possible, because let's be honest, you got are the ones doing all the work. So I think it's really good that we engage with you as much as we can. So today I'll be giving a quick rundown, essentially, of how the Food Standards Code actually gets updated, focusing specifically on Chapter 3 of the code, and using a current application that we've got to sort of demonstrate how it all works. So very, very quickly, quick rundown about EHANZ. We are Australia's only binational government agency. Not everything that EHANZ does is adopted in New Zealand, but in general, we're a binational agency based in Canberra and Wellington. We are part of the Australian Government Health Portfolio, and our main role is developing food evidence-based standards, which are all located in the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code. So the code is a legislative instrument that is given effect by state and territory or New Zealand laws. And as such, EHANZ is not responsible for enforcement or interpretation of the code. So we are not a regulatory agency in any way. We don't do any enforcement. That also means that we do not interpret the code. So although we write it and we maintain it, it's not for us to tell regulators how they should read that code. It's up to regulators to interpret it as they see wish. So I'm sure you're very, very familiar with the code, but if not, we have the 4 chapters and the schedules. these laws are enforced by food regulatory authorities for imported food in Australia. The Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, they operate at the border. Chapters 1 and 2 apply, apart from a couple of exceptions, but chapters 1 and 2 apply across Australia and New Zealand. Chapter 3 and 4, the food safety standards and the primary production standards, operate purely in Australia. New Zealand has their own food safety standards. But in general, the rest of it operates across both countries, except for a couple of little minor differences. But today, purely because I work with Chapter 3, and I've worked on Chapter 3 my entire life, my entire working life. We're going to look at basically in a bit more in depth about how Chapter 3 gets updated and the processes behind that. So how does the code actually stay up to date? So for FSANZ staff, we're always on the lookout for emerging issues, and we want to stay current on scientific trends and analysis as much as possible. The code, it's important to note the code's not a static document. It's not something that we wrote 20 years ago and then stays as is. It is continually updated through either an application or a proposal to amend the code. So today we're going to be focusing on an application, using a recent application to talk through the process. So examples of other examples of applications to change the code. It's usually these are done by businesses. Propose an application to change the code. This is usually, a lot of the time, it's done in result of, say, novel foods. So as a new type of food, a new kind of food that isn't already permissible in Australia. Businesses will submit an application to allow this new novel food to be sold. So a recent and quite interesting example in that sphere is the cell-cultured quail. So fairly recently, FSANZ approved an application from a business to sell cell-cultured quail, to manufacture and sell cell-cultured quail in Australia. So that was a big, huge thing because nothing like that has ever been done before. It doesn't have a history of use, so that involved a lot of work doing that sort of work. But in general, other applications, say new processing aids and novel foods. So essentially, FSANZ is assessing how safe these foods are before they're allowed to be sold in Australia. FSANZ can also independently propose a code update. So as I said, it's the two ways that the code gets updated, through an application or a proposal. So FSANZ can independently do a proposal to update the code. So some examples of other proposals that FSANZ has worked on. You might be familiar in Australia, at least, with the food safety management tools, 322A, that come about through a proposal. There's also things like the plain English allergen labelling, egg standards and primary production requirements, energy labeling and alcoholic beverages, infant formula, definitions for gene technology and new breeding techniques, added sugar claims, and many, many, many more. The horticulture standards. So all these things were done independently by FSANZ. They were not, an application made by a business. This was an update to the code, motivated through government. So when we make changes to the code, we spend an awful amount of time doing research into the proposed changes and then engaging with the impacted industries, states and territories to make sure we get their feedback. So a great deal of our work actually involves liaising with the relevant food safety agencies throughout Australia. For example, New South Wales Food Authority or Queensland Health or WA Health or someone like that. So as I mentioned, FSANZ is not a regulator, so there's no point in FSANZ creating new standards if food businesses don't understand them and regulators don't feel like they can reliably enforce them. So we do a lot of consultation through that. So when we're developing our measures, we've got three sort of key pillars that we are guided by when we're developing new standards or changing the standards. First and foremost, food standards are intended to protect the health and safety of consumers and support longer-term public health objectives. The next objective is providing adequate information to consumers. So food labels are a major source of food information. And this information that is the code sort of relies on is divided up into three tiers. We have food safety, we have preventative health, and we have community values. So example of some food safety information for consumers would be, allergen declarations on labeling. An example of the preventative health tier would be something like compositional or nutritional levels. So the nutritional information panel required on labeling would be information for preventative health and consumer values. And then finally, the third tier is consumer values information, which would be something like, information regarding a food's genetic GM status or irradiated foods or something like that. And then finally, the third pillar is preventing misleading and deceptive conduct. So again, that's more focusing on labeling. So statements on labels and other claims must be truthful, must not mislead or deceive consumers in relation to the safety, composition, nutritional value, or stated benefit of the food. So they're the sort of three key pillars that we look at when we look at updating the code. But when we're looking at Chapter 3 in particular, there's one part of the EHANZ Act that we are guided by, which really stands out. And that is this part of the EHANZ Act that says we have the need for standards to be based on risk analysis using the best available scientific evidence, promotion of consistency between domestic and international food standards, and the desirability of an efficient and internationally competitive food industry. So these are legislative requirements written into the Food Act. So anything that we do must be guided by these principles. It's not optional or best practice for EHANZ to base standards on best available scientific evidence. It's required by the law. So that inevitably brings us to the application in question for today, and what I'm going to look at is sort of a case study. So application A1314, permitting small dogs and cats in aircraft cabins. So in September 2024, Virgin Australia made an application to EHANZ to amend Chapter 3, Clause 24. I'm sure those of you in Australia will be very familiar with 322, Clause 24 regarding pests and animals in food businesses. So they were seeking an amendment to that to allow for cats and dogs to be permitted in aircraft cabins where food is sold. So there's currently an exemption for dogs in outdoor dining areas because an aircraft cabin is an indoor dining area. Dogs and cats are not allowed. So they are seeking to change the code essentially to allow cats and dogs specifically inside aircraft cabins. So this was a very significant application at the time because applications actually to amend Chapter 3 are very rare. It's not often that somebody in the a member of the public or a business decides that the food safety standards need to be changed in some way and have the evidence to back that up. So it's very rare for us to get an application for Chapter 3. And at the time, late last year, there was a lot of media interest around dogs in indoor dining areas in general. So we knew that this was going to be a relatively sensitive application. This was going to involve a lot of work and a lot of consultation. So when this came in, we knew immediately this was going to be a pretty big amount of work for us. So the first part of going through an application is what we call the administrative assessment phase. So once an application is made, EHANZ has a limited amount of time to conduct a sort of preliminary assessment of the application, essentially to make sure it contains everything required for EHANZ to then actually do the work on it. So the application handbook sets out all the requirements. So that's the Bible for us for applications. That sets out every sort of requirement that an application must contain before EHANZ can actually accept it. So the requirements in the handbook range from things like formatting. So is it in English? Are there adequate copies provided? Are the contact details correct? All the sort of administrative stuff. Then the purpose, so the purpose of the application, and then the justification. So it has to require certain things like a justification. So why is this change required? And then we're looking at the regulatory impact. So, what are the costs and benefits to the community, businesses, and government for the proposed change? And then finally, the big one here, this is a really key thing for Chapter 3 applications, is supporting information. So information to support the application. So that means an application to support to change Chapter 3 must contain surveys or data, a full literature review, a significant risk assessment, all the things basically to demonstrate that this is something that has been thought through correctly. The point is essentially that if somebody, a member of the public or a business, is making an application to amend the code, basically they need to be providing justification and evidence commensurate to what FSANZ would have to in a proposal. So FSANZ is an organization with 100 odd people. When we do a proposal, we have to do a lot of work involved in that. So essentially an application needs to contain as much information as a proposal because we are guided by the Act, of course, and the Act says we must do things based on these criteria. So an application is no different than a proposal in that way. It needs to contain as much information as possible. Because assessing applications takes a significant amount of time and resources, and FSANZ isn't exactly resource rich. So this admin assessment stage is essential to ensure that FSANZ we don't have to invest our limited resources into work that is not genuine or that is frivolous or unnecessary. So the upshot of that is we did an administrative assessment on the Virgin application and we accepted it as a genuine. It wasn't rejected, it was accepted. So that was in October 2024. Then, once we've accepted the application, then it dawns on us that we're going to have to do a whole lot of work now to actually properly assess the application. So there's a bunch of questions that we need to ask ourselves and start doing preliminary work to get the application moving. The first thing we usually do is assemble a project team. So FSANZ is made up of a bunch of different scientists and specialists in a whole different wide variety of areas. So we need to assemble a team who have the correct expertise, basically, to actually properly assess an application of this nature. So for A1314, clearly we're going to need food safety experts. We're going to need microbiologists. We need social scientists. We need comms people. We need legal people. And they're really the key areas of expertise we need. Other sorts of applications, they might need toxicologists, you might need labeling experts, you might need nutritionists and different experts like that. And then our initial stages of consultation begin. So Chapter 3 is administered by state and local regulatory agencies. So, of course, input from state and local regulatory agencies is essential. So we had multiple meetings with representatives from all Australian states and territories to discuss the application, where we could, hear what concerns that they had about the proposal, and to seek their feedback, so that we could take that away with us, and that would feed into the actual assessment process for the application. So then when we're taking in the whole of the application, we need to look at what are the likely key risks to be assessed and managed. So clearly in this one, the microbiological food safety from the addition of cats and dogs in an enclosed environment is the critical risk that is being introduced by this amendment. So Virgin had actually proposed a range of controls. So they had identified all the risks, or what they saw as all the risks involved with this, and then they proposed a range of controls to ameliorate those risks. So the sort of things we're looking at for the risks, we're looking at animals being enclosed in a container at all times, the fact that they're selling low risk prepackaged food, that they're not allowing contact between their staff and the animals, limiting the number of animals on each flight, and all those sorts of things. So they're the sorts of controls that they had proposed to try and to ameliorate the risks they had identified. We also needed to, for this application, sit down and directly sort of write out what was going to be out of scope. So we are a food standards agency. This is a food safety standard. We are specifically looking at the risks, food safety risks. So that means we can't really have regard to things that are outside the scope of food safety. So in particular for this, we knew that one of the biggest concerns was going to be around dander and fur allergies. and also people who have a fear or a dislike of animals. There might be some animal welfare concerns as well. So these are sort of things that are outside the scope of food safety. So we knew that we're going to have to be clear that these were not parameters that we were actually going to investigate. So we can't look at the risk assessment of dander allergies, because that is not a food safety issue. That's going to be outside the scope of our assessment. And then finally, we look at, is a regulation impact statement required? Which is an awful amount of work as well. But luckily, in our case, this is actually a deregulatory amendment, a proposed amendment. So we're actually removing a restriction as opposed to introducing a new regulation. So lucky for us, it was deemed that a regulation impact statement would not be required. So once we've got all our preliminary work done, we've done some initial consultation, we know what our key risks are, we know what we're looking for, we then get stuck into our risk assessment. So we have a team of microbiologists who have a look at this. They do their own risk, we do our own risk assessment. So again, I need to remind you what the EHANZ Act says, that we can only do things based on risk analysis using the best available scientific evidence. So Virgin had included their own risk assessment based on what they believed was the best available scientific evidence. So it was up to our team then to evaluate that work, see if there was anything missing, see if there was, intentionally or otherwise left out in regards to health and safety risks associated with animals or with dogs and cats in specifically in regards to food safety. So was their information correct? Is there anything missing? And what is the most contemporary scientific knowledge on zoonoses, basically between cats, dogs, and humans? What are the risks? How are those risks presented in an aircraft cabin specifically? How can those risks be addressed? And what controls are in place elsewhere? This is also somewhere where we look at what's happening elsewhere in other countries, what controls are in place in other countries where this is already allowed, and all that sort of stuff. So that results in the drafting of a risk assessment, which then gives a recommendation on what the key controls are, the key risks are, and what the controls might be. We also at the same time need to look at consideration of the costs and benefits of the application. So the EHANZ Act requires EHANZ to have regard to whether the costs that would arise from the proposal would outweigh the direct and indirect benefits to the community, government, or industry that would arise from the proposed measure. So what are going to be the impacts on the community? What are the impacts on businesses? What are the impacts on governments? What are the pros and cons? Do the benefits outweigh the impacts? And if so, then it can go ahead. But basically, if the cost-benefit analysis says that the impacts don't outweigh the benefits, then it would recommend this not go ahead. So in this case, it was seen that the benefits would outweigh the costs, and therefore, we could proceed with the application. Once that is done, that's like the midpoint of the sort of application process. This happened earlier this year, where the risk assessment, the costs and benefits are all packaged up, and then we look at drafting. Okay, so we look at, okay, so here's what the risk assessment says. What are the key risks? What are the key controls? Here's the costs and benefits. How can we actually draft this change to the Food Standards Code legally to make it, applicable? How is it going to be enforceable and all that sort of thing? What will the actual change to the code be? We look at that. We work closely with our legal team, and in this case, we got a lot of feedback from the states and territories as well on this, because again, this needs to be enforceable, it needs to be applicable, it needs to be effective. So we came up with this proposed drafting. So the proposed drafting that gets put into what we call the call for submissions document. So the call for submissions document contains everything. It contains, Virgin's original application minus any, commercial and confidence information. It contains a risk assessment. It contains, the cost benefit analysis, and it contains proposed drafting. So in March 2025, we published the call for submissions on our website for A1314. So this is an integral process to ensure that the community, business, and regulators are provided with all the information needed to demonstrate how FSANZ has reached its proposed amendment to the code. So transparency is taken extremely seriously at FSANZ, so we need to be able to demonstrate that we are adhering to our legal requirements under the Act. There's nothing secret or shady going on. This isn't just some, brown paper bag delivered by a Virgin to FSANZ to let us quickly allow dogs and cats on board. No, we have to be very, very transparent to show that we are adhering to exactly what we need to do under our Act. And the call for submissions process is a key part of that. So the call for submission process allows anyone to make a submission that either supports or does not support the proposed amendment. And once that submission process finished, so that finished, I think, in late April. Once we have a little bit of time to look at those submissions, first and foremost, we then publish those on our website. So there is a link there. I'm not sure if you'll get a copy of this presentation, but there is a link there, or you can just Google it, look on the FSANZ website. It actually contains a link to all the submissions made for each application or proposal. So again, transparency. We need to show exactly what we received. So the submissions can either be, a very simple acknowledgement, that they support or they do not support with whatever their minor concerns are, or they might be, thousands of word submissions from, particularly by regulators, are very keen to make detailed submissions. So they might be thousands of words. They might have attachments or links to supporting documents. So there's a very wide variety of the kinds of information that we get through a call for submissions process. And because these are, this could be members of the public, they could be regulators, they could be business people. You get, a wide range. You get you run the absolute gamut of the kinds of feedback that you get. This application actually attracted a fair bit of attention. So I think we received about 50 odd submissions, which is relatively high for the things that we do. A lot of the smaller novel foods and weird sort of new corn line or new barley species or something like that might only get one or two, and then you've got very, very controversial ones like P1055, I think it was a proposal around new breeding techniques and sort of definitions of genetically modified food that received more than 1,000 submissions. So wide gamut on the sorts of things, but for Virgin one, it was about 50 odd. So I'll just quickly say here, we're now at the point of the process where I can't reveal too much more in the way of specifics because this application still hasn't finished. So I'll get to the finishing process in a sec. So this is now sort of theoretical stuff. So we're at the point now where I can't reveal too much specifics about A1314. But essentially, to focus on transparency, once again, FSANZ is required to consider all the submissions that are made as part of this process. We don't just write them off because they're spelled weird or they've got swearing in them or the people have threatened to kill us or whatever, which sometimes does happen. We can't write those off. We still need to consider every sort of submission that is made and take it on its own merits. And all submissions are responded to, and FSANZ must be able to explain why they agree or disagree with the concerns raised as part of this process. So the final approval or rejection report contains an extensive summary of all the issues raised in submissions and FSANZ's response to each. So not only do we publish the whole list of all the submissions that we get, in the final approval or rejection report, we then go through and basically address all of the concerns with a response from FSANZ. So again, transparency, we need to be seen to be showing that we are taking feedback on board, and it's not just like a rubber stamp process that FSANZ was always going to do what FSANZ was always going to do. And then we come to the final stage of an application process, which is approval or rejection. So the final outcome is a approval or rejection. So that's the final for a tremendous amount of work carried out by many, many people. It brings us to the approval or rejection process. So a report is drafted by the project manager and the project team, which is then goes through so many levels of approval and signing off before it actually makes it to its final destination. So managers, the legal team, our comms team, the delegate, the CEO, and then finally it goes to the FSANZ board. And it's the board's responsibility to either, sign off on the approval or the rejection of an application. So once the board has signed off on the approval or rejection, it is then sent to the food ministers meeting, presented to food ministers, where it's then, and then after that, it's gazetted with immediate effect. So if this goes through, if it is approved by the FSANZ board, will go to the food ministers meeting, and then will be gazetted with immediate effect. So basically, what that means is, once it's been approved, the Food Standards Code is taken to have been amended with this change in it. So, the very next day, if you wanted to, you could go out and you could start seeing cats and dogs on planes in this thing. I'm not saying it's been approved. I'm not saying it's been rejected, just theoretically. That's what could happen in this process. And that's more or less the extent of it. That's how the Food Standards Code gets updated, in particular Chapter 3. It's a very long process. It takes a lot of work by a lot of different people. But I just wanted to stress that it's not a process that is taken lightly. It's not something that is sort of scribbled on the back of a napkin and then, FSANZ goes away and then comes back with a change to the code. There is a lot of science, there are a lot of evidence behind it, and we are required by law to make sure that any change is done thoroughly and in the best interests of the public. So that's it. If there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to have a crack at them.
Thank you very much, Judd. That was a fascinating presentation. We do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first one is, how will this impact, I'm assuming if it is approved, how will this impact food outlets in airport terminals and dining areas with taking cats and dogs through the terminal?
Yeah, so this application doesn't have regard to that, because the rules around how animals are treated in food businesses are already established in the code. So this application doesn't change any of that. So this application purely affects animals on board aircraft. If it does get approved, it doesn't impact what the laws are in regards to animals in food businesses in the terminal.
And another question is, this person understands the scope covers the food safety aspects, but in relation to the cat/dog allergy concerns and other public health issues generally, how does FSANZ ensure making a change to the code doesn't create other public health issues? For example, are there other mechanisms that may come into play?
Yeah, so as I sort of mentioned, it's not our remit to look into what those changes will be. There are other pieces of legislation that impact this. So it might be the Workplace Health and Safety Act, might be public health acts, all those sorts of things might be impacted by this. But FSANZ is limited in its scope purely within food safety. We can't have regard for those sorts of things outside of the scope of food safety. So whatever impacts are created by that is something for Virgin Australia to deal with later on.
Yep. And another question, if an application does not provide an adequate risk assessment, what is the process to address this?
So if the application doesn't provide an adequate risk assessment, usually at the administrative assessment stage, that will have been identified. The applicant will be given time to, provide further information. But if FSANZ isn't satisfied that that a risk assessment has been done and carried out properly at the administrative assessment stage, then basically we will not accept the application. So the application would have been rejected. We don't even accept the application. And I guess the thing is that doesn't get published at all. So there's no public knowledge that someone has made an application and then that has subsequently been rejected if it doesn't make it to the full assessment stage. So even though I can very clearly say that very, very few applications have ever made it through for Chapter 3 for it to be assessed at. Every now and then we might get an application for Chapter 3 that doesn't make it to the actual assessment stage. It stalls at administrative assessment.
Yep. And the last question is, how long do you approximately think the rest of this application process that you've presented on will take
Yeah,
until we have
so
an outcome?
we have a board meeting, I think, scheduled for the end of this month, where this application will be presented to the board. So barring any unforeseen circumstances, a decision will be made on this application then. And then once that's done, it'll be scheduled in for the next food ministers meeting. But I'm sure there'll be plenty of comms around that, depending on the outcome.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today. I really enjoyed your presentation, and
Pleasure.
I would now like to hand over to Tanya to introduce the next speaker from New Zealand. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks so much, Judd, for your presentation. Geez, it's a crazy world we live in these days, isn't it? Things are just changing left, right, and centre. And I guess that's also the theme of this World Food Safety Day as well, with scientists in action being the theme, using science and using risk analysis to actually cope with these changing demands in our growing world. On our side of the ditch, it is my privilege this afternoon to introduce Chris Hewins, who is well known to our New Zealand audience from New Zealand Food Safety, where he is a principal advisor for food and wine systems in the Food Risk Management Directorate. Chris has presented at many of our conferences and initiatives before and is always a real go-to for technical advice for us as well on our side of the ditch. He leads multiple projects, contributes to, as I said, technical advice, developing food standards, maintaining food safety systems, and he's vastly experienced in the world of environmental health and food safety. Fun fact, which was also advertised in our flyer as well, he's also a commercial yacht skipper. So good man to know if you want to sail the seas. That might be the next place we see our food safety changing, not just in the air, but also on the water. But today he's going to talk to us about future foods and the regulatory system within New Zealand. So it's my pleasure to welcome Chris for your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Tanya, and thank you also, Melissa, and environmental health colleagues for your kind invitation to present on future foods and celebrating World Food Safety Day. Congratulations to Environmental Health Australia on the recent MOU with the UK CIEH. It's a great opportunity for expanding horizons and achieving common environmental health goals. And I say that as a chartered environmental health practitioner with CIH. And thank you to Judd for your insights. And I'd certainly attest to the thoroughness of the FSANZ novel food process. There's always been innovation in food, and we're seeing increasingly a lot of work across and along the food chain to try and improve current production practices and identify new ways of producing food through science and technology. And Judd mentioned it's all about the science, and a big part of our work is horizon scanning to identify what might be heading our way with food safety risks needing to be managed. So I'll be taking a bit of a dive into some of the things that are happening and why some of the future food ideas come into prominence and the potential for them to bring new risks, and briefly how the regulatory framework is being applied. But we often see that when it comes to producing future foods, many of the processes have roots in the past. And there are currently a couple of main motivators for finding new foods and new food sources. And first, a growing world population, and we'll need to feed more mouths in future years, meaning more food's going to need to be found, and a lot more, according to these estimates. Agriculture today already uses almost half the world's vegetated land, but good productive land is facing depletion from expanding cities and a range of other pressures. We also live in a world where the UN estimates over 2.8 billion people, that's around 34% of the world's population, can't afford a healthy diet. And these people simply eat so they can live, while an increasingly affluent portion of the remaining 66% live so they can eat and post their culinary experiences on social media. More mouths to feed in the coming decades means more food needs to be produced against the background of natural and man-made events that increasingly affect agricultural output. We don't have to look too far to find a number of relatively untapped and plentiful food sources around the globe, so we could always change what we eat to include them, but not all of them are going to be the top pick on everyone's menu. But then again, I guess it depends how hungry you are. harvesting and eating some jellyfish species popular in China and Southeast Asia for use in dishes like salads, sushis, and noodles. We already use algae in the food industry as thickeners and additives in dairy products, while some European countries are using algae instead of salt in bread making. Researchers in the Netherlands and elsewhere are developing algal farming and drying methods, including Cawthron Institute in New Zealand, among others, is looking at algal strains for food applications. From an environmental health perspective, microalgae are interesting. They absorb pollutants and can hold 10% of their weight in heavy metals. So as well as food uses, they can be useful for remediating pollution. So something to bear in mind if microalgae are harvested from the wild rather than farming them. Seaweed, eaten widely in China and Japan. We'll be familiar with nori seaweed that's farmed and used globally in sushi dishes. And while on seaweed, UK company Nopla has developed and is marketing in Europe a flexible seaweed-based edible coating for water and other beverages and food products designed to replace plastic packaging. This is a great idea. Insects, great source of food nutrition in some countries, not yet mainstream in Australia and New Zealand. It's mainly because of the yuck factor and the ready availability of other foods. And insects as food in New Zealand is currently limited to cricket flower, novelty insect confectionery and grubs at wild food festivals. But they might creep into our future foods in other ways than obviously looking like insects. And recent research has been vertically farming black soldier fly larvae and processing them into an oil with similar properties to palm oil, but with a much greater yield per square metre of growing space than in palm plantations. And there's some indications that people in Australia and New Zealand will be willing to eat insect-based products that provide benefits from nutrition and sustainability. So we may see more insect flours and oils becoming incorporated sort of by stealth into our foods. So with the growing world population, but finite amount of agricultural land, helping to maximize food production is a big area where technology is playing a part. Precision agriculture uses advanced technologies like soil sensors and GPS to optimize crop yields and minimize resource usage, providing real-time data on crop health and crop nutrient requirements, enabling the farmer to adjust agrochemical applications that are proportionate to need. Drones fitted with pest recognition technology can deliver more precise crop spraying, reduce spray drift, reduce agrochemical costs, and reduce risk from exceeding spray residue limits. Automatic harvesting using robotics with sensors and vision capabilities, identifying crops at optimal ripeness for reducing crop waste and contamination. Vertical farming, as mentioned for the soldier flies, grows crops in stacked layers or towers in controlled environments. It's being used in inner city areas in the US that are otherwise classed as food deserts, where people have limited access to healthy food. Local vertical farming makes use of disused buildings to make salads and vegetables more affordable. Hydroponics provides greater control over crop inputs and can reduce water use by 90% compared to growing crops in fields. And molecular farming, new techniques can use existing agricultural infrastructure to grow crops modified with animal proteins and fats. And company Miracle in New Zealand is one of those developing ideas to improve the taste and texture of plant-based alternative foods that currently don't meet the taste and mouthfeel that consumers expect to match the original animal-based product. So the lower right box shows conventional soybean in the upper picture, and the lower picture shows soybean with DNA modified to incorporate protein from pork. One of the things going to need to be bear in mind, of course, from blending plant and animal properties is going to be accurate labeling, particularly in countries where animal blended or the animal blended with the plant is not normally used for food. This brings us to another industry looking at unconventional ways of feeding people in space exploration. Need for quantities of food on long space voyages is also driving science. It costs around $20,000 a day just to feed one astronaut on the International Space Station. It's not like you can just pop down to the corner shop if you run out of supplies. Food requires a regular supply, resupply through cargo spacecraft, and over time, food itself can degrade in quality and nutrition. NASA and other space agencies are planning long-duration missions to Moon and Mars. So a key factor is figuring out how to feed crews during their weeks, months, or years in space. Over the past 10 years or so, researchers have been exploring ideas for growing food in space, testing various crops and equipment to work out how they can do this without a lot of extra hardware or power. And so far, NASA's grown a variety of edible plants and learned a lot about horticulture in space. Some shots here showing chilies being grown and harvested on the space station. And perhaps not surprisingly, tasty food plays a very important part in keeping astronauts happy. Challenge of growing plants in gravity is providing enough water to keep them healthy without drowning them. And aeroponics is being used where a mist is applied to the roots for plant growth. And this offers weight saving over hydroponics and traditional soil crops. And it's also helping to grow crops on Earth where there's sort of marginal lands. And back on Earth, another method of food processing is playing a part in future foods, and fermenting food to preserve it and enhance its flavor can be traced back thousands of years to civilizations in Egypt and East Asia and Greece with evidence of fermented foods. And we see that tradition carried forwards today to foods we eat, such as yogurt, cheeses, beer, wine, and fermented salamis. And fermented foods are currently going through a bit of a resurgence. And certainly in New Zealand, we've seen a rise in product availability of foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, kefir, and cultured milk. And with an increase in the interest in personal health generated by the COVID pandemic, fermented foods are now being marketed as functional foods, foods offering some form of health benefit from eating them in addition to being tasty food with just the nutrition content. And you'll see those words like added fiber or fiber, and probiotic and prebiotic adjectives all being added. And these benefits are driving customer interest and demand. Fermentation is also an effective and interesting way to produce large quantities of high-grade food biomass products. And we see with growing yeast on low-grade mediums like food waste products. It's not a new process. Corn is a textured fungal mycoprotein food from biomass fermentation that was first marketed in the UK in 1985 and is available in supermarkets here. The organism is fermented in a bioreactor with water, glucose, oxygen, and nitrogen, and under optimum conditions doubles in volume every 5 hours. And the company grows the protein equivalent of 3,000 beef cattle a week. So producing air proteins is a more recent innovation with the company Solar Foods in Scandinavia, developing an edible microbial protein alternative to soy, eggs, milk, and meat, literally from thin air, using gas fermentation to produce biomass. Air proteins are single-cell organisms that act like plants and capture CO2 and convert it to nutrients. They're mixed with carbon dioxide, oxygen, hydrogen, and water. And the air protein, which is called soline, is harvested, purified, dried, and powdered. As can be seen from the nutritional breakdown, it's rich in proteins, nutrients, and amino acids, and can be mixed with other food ingredients and formed into meat and seafood analogues or added to food to enrich their protein content. Solar Foods was a winner in the NASA Deep Space Food Challenge recently, which seeks innovation in food solutions for their long-distance missions. They recognize that soline offers a way to produce protein in space using carbon dioxide exhaled by astronauts and hydrogen, which is a byproduct of oxygen generation. So a great way to produce protein from potentially problem gases. Not many food businesses currently employ retired astronauts, but Solar Foods recently brought former NASA astronaut Tim Coppert on board as an advisor with the aim of getting their food into space. Biotechnology has also harnessed fermentation as an alternative way of producing specific proteins and other products for food. Precision fermentation uses microbes as cell factories to produce specific proteins or food ingredients. Cell excretes as a natural metabolic byproduct. Again, not particularly new technology. Our friend and foe, E. coli, was precision fermented in the 1970s to mass produce insulin to treat diabetes and eliminate the need for animal-based sources of insulin. In 1990, the enzyme chymosin was produced by precision fermentation of a genetically modified yeast. And chymosin is the component of rennet that curdles casein in milk and was traditionally gathered from calves' stomachs for use in cheese making. And now around 80% of the world's cheese is produced using precision fermented meat. Precision fermented rennet, not meat. Dairy companies like Fonterra in New Zealand are researching alternative protein sources. It's being used in the US to produce egg proteins like albumin without using chickens to create egg substitutes for baking and cooking. Precision fermented gelatin makes products like desserts and gummy sweets suitable for vegans and vegetarians. Fish proteins are being developed to create alternatives to traditional seafood that could help reduce overfishing. And novel food ingredients developed through precision fermentation can bring unique properties to food. FSANZ are given permission for the use of precision fermented soy leg hemoglobin, a non-animal source of iron, which gives plant-based meat alternatives the distinctive flavour and colour of cooked meat. So why stop at cultivating plants and fungal proteins? What about growing animal cells for food? Cell culturing meat is seen as an alternative to the tradition of farming animals in fields. Research has been ongoing since the early 2000s, and the first product, a lab-grown beef burger, was demonstrated in 2013. Cell culturing techniques have been advancing quickly since then in 20 or so countries. In 2020, cultured chicken nuggets was the first cultured meat product to be given market approval in Singapore. In March 2023, an Australian company, Vow, unveiled a mammoth meatball cultured from prehistoric DNA to demonstrate the potential of cell-cultured foods. An animal cell culture is a form of biomass fermentation, but with two key differences. The process takes longer and needs more complex growth media. It's multi-stage and complex approach. Starts with sourcing and selecting cells taken by biopsy from the desired animal species. The laboratory cells are isolated from other tissue and grown, cleaned, and screened for microbial contaminants to establish a stable cell line. That will maintain the desired cell characteristics for constant and consistent production. Cell line development can take many months to complete, and cell lines are stored frozen in master cell banks. When needed for cultivation, a small number of cells taken from the master cell bank are grown to create a working cell bank. And a sample of cells drawn from the working cell bank is used to cultivate cell biomass in a bioreactor in a nutrient medium with an atmosphere designed for optimal growth. Scaffolding like microbeads can be used to provide a surface for cells to grow on. Different types and sizes of bioreactor and different types of growing media may be needed at different stages of the production process. And when cells have reached their maximum density and have the desired characteristics for the final food product, they're harvested so as to maintain tissue integrity and avoid microbial contamination. Harvested cells aren't the food product itself. They go into the food formulation stage of the process where they're mixed with plant material and conventional food ingredients and ultimately provide the structure, texture, and flavour of the food being replicated. So far, 6 countries have approved cell-cultured food products. The UK has approved a cell-cultured pet food. There are many more products in the pipeline. However, there are some countries and some US states that aren't as convinced and have legislated against it, mainly to protect their traditional food industries. As Judd was alluding to earlier, in Australia and New Zealand, FSANZ has just approved the addition to the list of foods of cell-cultured quail product, which is actually due for gazetting on the 18th of this month. And it shouldn't be too long before it's available in Australian restaurants and not long afterwards in New Zealand. And there's a lot of interest in cell-cultured meats from countries like Singapore that have to import a significant proportion of their food and are vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions. Producing cell-cultured foods offers these countries greater food security. And in another worldly context, it's also seen as a food production option for space travel. Israeli company Aleph Farms have worked on projects in space to grow animal cells for food, and they produced the first cultivated meat in space with an experiment, the International Space Station assembling cultivated meat tissue using a 3D printer. Forming food products and getting the analog product to look like the food it replicates is carried out by 3D printing, and overall cell culturing and processing is a very exacting process, and getting one element wrong, introducing spoilage organisms, for example, can mean cells won't grow to the volume needed for commercial production, or cells won't have the desired characteristics needed for the food product. So it's not a process you're currently going to find operating out of a home garage. Although in the future, who knows, a bioreactor and 3D printer in the kitchen might be as common as an air fryer. It does give some clues to the technology behind delivering the gourmet meals that currently appear to feed sci-fi space crews at the press of a button. It's quite unique as a food sector, and animal cell cultured food doesn't have really parallels in the production of animal products we otherwise eat. Yes, animal cells are cultured for pharmaceutical and research purposes, but substances from the cells are used in medications, but the cells themselves aren't consumed. Because the novelty of the cell culturing process, there's quite interest in the food safety aspects. Food and Agriculture Organization and World Health Organization recognize this and investigated aspects and published a report. Basically identifies there are some potentially new food safety hazards or concerns, but the majority, such as microbiological contamination and residues, aren't new hazards, the sorts of things that are faced in food production generally. We've got a number of risk mitigating tools already available for these hazards, such as good hygienic practice, good agricultural practice, and good manufacturing practice, as well as good lab practice. So these work in tandem with methodologies like HACCP for systematically assessing hazards and identify controls and conducting relevant safety assessments. And we're fairly familiar with applying those sorts of tools. As the FAO report also identified that as each cell cultured product may involve a different cell source, different culture medium, and various other differing conditions, case-by-case approach is more suited for food safety assessment. And Judd's given us a pretty clear understanding of what that novel food process means from a EHANZ process. And as part of the pre-market assessment of the cell-cultured quail product, EHANZ looked at the first three stages in cell culturing for microbiology, biotechnology, toxicology, allergenicity, nutrition, and dietary intake and exposure. I'm not going to steal Judd and Ben and the EHANZ team's thunder, as they've been totally immersed in the application for over 2 years and all the details surrounding it. Suffice to say, EHANZ are setting up a regulatory framework for cell-cultured foods designed to regulate the manufacture and labelling through hazard identification and risk management. So in a nutshell, cell culturing food businesses will need to operate with a food safety program, and products containing cell-cultured food ingredients will need to meet labelling requirements. As was mentioned earlier, food safety requirements in Part 3 of the code don't apply to New Zealand, but the New Zealand risk-based regulatory framework will also require animal cell culturing to take place under a risk management program under the Animal Products Act or food control plan under the Food Act. Both of these enable the setting of secondary and tertiary requirements for food processing through regulations and notices where they might be needed to support the food safety framework. We don't have any New Zealand food operators submitting a novel food application to EHANZ for cell-cultured food yet, but they might not be too far away. Once they would have completed a successful novel food assessment from EHANZ, the operator would need to register a validated documentary food safety system with MPI, food control plan, or risk management program, pretty similar to a food safety program. It's obviously a highly technical process. It's going to be important to identify where the competent people will come from to operate processes and be able to evaluate and verify the various stages of cell culturing. So any opportunity to share knowledge between jurisdictions are good opportunities and will help everyone involved as the cell culturing sector moves forward. In New Zealand, we've certainly also been looking at what imported cell cultured foods will look like at the border, and a product arriving from anywhere other than Australia will not be able to cross the border directly. These cell cultured products coming potentially from Europe or States would need to be assessed by EHANZ before they could be considered as food for sale. And as well as food safety, there's a large biosecurity hurdle for importing cell cultured foods into New Zealand, which becomes a very high hurdle if the food is uncooked and cells are potentially viable. So the Department of Agriculture, Fish and Forestry in Australia have also been pondering the same for products coming to Australia from places other than New Zealand. It isn't all plain sailing for industries developing food ideas for the future, whether on terra firma or the depths of space. And there are a lot of unknowns and challenges currently in our animal cell cultivation, going from lab scale to industrial output. The cost of the technologies currently makes products much more expensive than compared to conventional alternatives. And creating a customer base is hard when there's only a limited level of production and cost is uncompetitive. The high setup costs of developing new cell lines, running a process is power hungry. Culturing medium is very expensive, needed in large quantities. Industries facing challenges from unknowns from cultivating volumes of animal cell biomass on a scale that's never been tried before and identified as being needed to bring the price of the product down. There have been recent concerns expressed about ultra-processed foods, and it's a roller coaster ride in a number of food sectors currently, with several meat alternative brands over the past year in particular having gone out of business. So regulatory and safety considerations are crucial, but the assessment of novel food products takes time. But as more becomes known about cell culturing and the products, timeframes should become shorter. An impact of cell culturing on traditional agriculture will need to be factored in as it develops. Traditional agriculture is not likely to be able to supply the amount of protein needed by 2050 if the projected world population of 10 billion materializes. So the short-term shortfall will need to come from other places. Maybe by then, we'll all be happily chomping on soldier fly larvae burgers or be signing up to practice environmental health on Mars. Either way, science and technology won't stand still, and we will have seen more adaptations of existing foods, new foods, continued science and technology, and innovations introduced into food production. I hope that has been this ramble into the future food chain has been of interest, and realise time is short today. If you've got any questions, happy to try and answer them now or out of session through Tanya and Melissa. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. It really is crystal ball gazing, this kind of stuff, isn't it? But actually, it's not that far away by the looks of it. You know, there's a lot of movement around the globe into this space to obviously fill that need, as you said, for this growing population of ours. Just a quick question I had was, you've possibly answered it a little bit already. You know, one of the most common concerns here is obviously over-processing, especially in a day and age. We saw after COVID, people growing their own produce, you know, keeping chickens and hens and going back to basics and less processed food, even using food as medicine and really getting away from that processing and additives into food. Do you foresee that this could have other, you know, offshoot issues if we are over-processing and manufacturing cell-based, cultured, lab-based foods? It's a little bit of that crystal ball question, I'm sorry. It's around what is that unknown thing going to look like, you know, 10, 20 years later of the effect of these foods we now start eating?
Yeah, and obviously the novel food process tries to look at that and look at you know, what people are gaining or not from nutrition and whether they are as much as we can do now to be safe. It's also quite interesting that yeah, there's sort of generational approaches to foods and regional approaches to foods. From sort of surveys done recently, people in our part of the world, Pacific, Southeast Asia, are far more likely to find acceptable cell cultured foods rather than Europe. And generationally, a lot of sort of Gen A now are actually driving what they eat. They're influenced by people and dietitians and influencers who are actually promoting traditional types of meat and two veg, and so there's a lot of things, a lot of drivers that are going to influence sort of where either the food becomes alternative foods become popular because they're not so highly processed, or they fuel some of the proteins that people are going to really need in countries where it's hard to get them. So yeah, it's a wide open, it's sort of a green field so far as future food goes. We need more. Current production methods can't necessarily provide that, so we need to look elsewhere.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Chris. Well, look, in the interest of time, we will wrap up there. Thanks for hanging in there with us, everyone. We were a few minutes late just starting this afternoon, but some really interesting presentations from both Judd and Chris. This is a hugely moving target in terms of how our food safety world is changing and evolving, and science, as we know, is at the forefront of that. And I guess our job in terms of environmental health and food verifiers and the like is to try and keep up with these trends as much as possible. And the ever adaptable nature of environmental health associations that we are will do our best to obviously deliver the information and tackle this one step at a time. Just on behalf of myself and Melissa, I think we both agree this is a much more sociable hour than the last time we met, as you mentioned, Melissa, with the American webinar at 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. respectively for us both. But look, we appreciate on both sides of the ditch everyone joining us today for our EHANZ collaborative webinar, and we look forward to seeing you for the next one later in the year. Thank you.